So we are going to have the next session. It is by me, Dr. Krishna Undela. So I'm currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Pharmacy Practice, Naipur Guwahati. I have completed my M.Pharmacy from Naipur Mohali, and thereafter I started working at JSS College of Pharmacy, Mysore as a lecturer. And meanwhile, I have completed my PhD at JSS Academy of Higher Education Research, Mysore. And my areas of research interest, it is on medication safety in special population and medication therapy management in cardiology, as well as evidence synthesis by conducting systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So I do have some publications on systematic review and meta-analysis. So based on my experience, I thought maybe I can explain a little bit about the insights of systematic review and meta-analysis. So from morning, we have seen the various aspects of systematic review and meta-analysis. Maybe from my presentation, we can just see the inside content of systematic review meta-analysis, how exactly we are going to be conduct the systematic review, what are the various steps we are going to be follow, and that's going to be useful for you for the afternoon sessions. So at least you can able to connect it, the afternoon sessions, with my presentation, what I'm going to have now. So just give me 2 minutes time so that I can share my screen and then we can start the presentation. So welcome back. And we are going to be discussed now in this session in detail about the systematic review and meta-analysis. So in this presentation, I'm going to mainly speak in detail about the systematic review and meta-analysis, and mainly we can discuss about what are the various steps we are going to be follow while conducting the systematic review and meta-analysis. Some of these slides initially they were not there in my presentation. I just added based on seeing some questions from the participants. Especially, they want to understand how this meta-analysis and systematic review are different and why they're going to be come together very often. So one thing maybe we need to understand here is the systematic reviews and meta-analysis are going to be come together always, many times. So the difference is going to be, first of all, we are going to be conduct the systematic review, and all the reviews are going to be the systematic reviews first. And if there is a possibility for conducting the meta-analysis, then we can also conduct the meta-analysis along with the systematic review, so that some of the systematic reviews are going to be even having the meta-analysis concept. But sometimes it may not be possible to conduct the meta-analysis, maybe especially if you take any descriptive kind of studies for conducting the systematic review. You may not have any data to pull the results, so that you may not able to conduct any meta-analysis, so that you may not have a meta-analysis as a part of your systematic review. So sometimes meta-analysis may be the part, or sometimes may not be the part, but of course, overall, we are going to be have the systematic reviews. So there's a difference between a meta-analysis and systematic review. I think just by saying in one line, of course, all the meta-analysis are going to be systematic reviews, but not all the systematic reviews may not be the meta-analysis. So meta-analysis may or may not be the component of any systematic review. That's what we can understand from this slide. And just to give you some more information, especially how and what is the difference between a review, a systematic review, and meta-analysis. I think this is going to be the question for everyone. How a normal review, a narrative review, is going to be different from a systematic review. So in the name itself, we can understand there is a difference. whatever the review we are conducting, if you conduct it systematically, so we are going to call it as a systematic review. And here you can see the definition for the same. Review means it's a general term for all attempts to synthesize the results and conclusions of 2 or more publications on a given topic. So in a review, what we're going to do is, if you ask maybe your student to come and give any topic, and then you can ask them to come back with a review article, he can just go and search maybe in the Google Scholar or maybe in the PubMed, and he can collect some articles, read those articles, write some information from these articles, and then get back to you with the review articles. And maybe he can have 2 or more publications. So from there he can take the information. But systematic review is not like that. We are going to be conduct the review only. But the difference here is going to be, we are going to be review strives to comprehensively identify and track down all the literature on a given topic. So if you see the highlights here, in a review, if you have 2 or more publications, it is fine. But in a systematic review, we need to have all the literature on a particular topic, what we are going to be consider for our systematic review. So we need to search all the databases, starting from Google Scholar, PubMed, and all other databases which you can access. And we are going to be collect all the information from the literature for the systematic review. And a meta-analysis, it is going to be a specific statistical strategy for assembling the results of several studies into a single estimate. So after doing the systematic review, what we are going to do is finally we can compile all the results, and we can put all the results together, and then we can come out with one final result by doing a meta-analysis and by applying some statistical strategies. That's what we are going to be call it as a meta-analysis. So this is a brief difference between how a narrative review, a normal review is different from a systematic review and a meta-analysis. And this picture is going to be depicts much better whatever I explained in the previous slide. So you can see majority of the information what you are getting from the literature may be the review articles. So majority of them are going to be the review articles. And out of the reviews, some of them may be the systematic reviews. Out of all the reviews what we are getting from the literature, some of them may be the reviews, systematic reviews. And out of all the systematic reviews, some of them may have the concept of meta-analysis as well. So they're going to have systematic reviews as well as the meta-analysis. So that's going to be the broader picture and the difference between a review, systematic review, and systematic review along with the meta-analysis. This slide actually I put it once again. It was not there in the in my original presentation. I put it once again just now. I have seen one question from the participants. So they were asking what is the difference between a narrative review and the systematic review? And maybe if you see in detail the difference between narrative review and systematic review, there are various differences. And that's the reason we can say systematic reviews are going to be much better always compared to a narrative review. If you see the differences one by one, in the narrative review, usually we don't see any methodology section. So if there is no methodology, obviously we cannot reproducible what we have written under the narrative review. So for that reason, if you want to check it, maybe you can give the same topic to 2 or 3 people. You can ask them to come back with a review article. And what are the information we are getting from all the 3 is going to be completely different many times. So why? Because there is no methodology. The first person has taken maybe few articles which are not taken by the other people. And that's the reason every person is going to be come out with one particular conclusion, even though the topic is same, but the final outcomes, what they're going to be get is going to be different completely. But coming to the systematic review, where we are going to have a clearly described protocol with a detailed methodology we are going to have, because there is a detailed methodology and we can reproducible what the other person done, we can reproduce the same thing. There is a possibility. And most of the times, even though it's a systematic review, sometimes people will consider this one as a review. But I feel personally, based on my experience, I feel personally, sometimes systematic review is going to be more than a research. We need to spend a lot of time than a research to come out with one particular systematic review, especially the Cochrane reviews. Usually it is going to be take minimum 2 to 3 years to come out with one particular Cochrane systematic review, even after there are a number of people are involved in one particular review. Maybe 3 or 4 people are involved in the review, and it is going to take lots of time to come out with a systematic review. In a narrative review, we're going to do the limited search. I think most of the times we can go and search in databases which are available with us so that we can have some publication bias. But in a systematic review, we can try to have the access for many databases, and we can go and search comprehensively Sometimes we can include even the unpublished information as well in a systematic review. So I'll mention from where we can take the unpublished information for conducting a systematic review. And in a narrative review, mostly we can include all the types of study designs irrespective of the study design. We can include any information from RCT, observation studies, case report, case series, and we can include any type of information here. But systematic review, we need to select the study designs. So which kind of studies we are going to be include in a systematic review, we are going to be clearly defined in a protocol. So either we are going to be include the systematic reviews of RCTs or the systematic reviews of observation studies or any other study designs. We need to mention it very clearly in the protocol. And often we are going to be evaluate the validity. It is not that even though we are taking all the RCTs, we are going to be blindly take them into the study and come out with the findings. We need to evaluate the validity of each and every study and try to understand that is it a quality systematic review or not, to give the final conclusion from the systematic review. And in narrative review, mainly we are going to be rely upon the p-values which are given in the articles. But in a systematic review, we are going to be perform the meta-analysis by using various effect sizes along with their confidence intervals, so that whatever the information we are going to be get out of the systematic review is going to be much more precise and accurate than the narrative review. So we are going to be use vote counting. That means we are giving each trial the same weightage. That means every article we are going to be considered as the same article for a narrative review. But that's going to be different in case of systematic review. We are going to be give a different weightages for different articles in case of systematic review. You just remember this terminology weightages. Maybe I can explain to you in detail when I come to my other slides. And narrative reviews are going to be mainly descriptive in nature. We are going to be just describe the information here. And systematic reviews, because we are conducting the meta-analysis, because we are pooling the results from different clinical trials, so that we are going to be have a tower of power. A tower of power in the sense, if you combine 10 studies which are having 1,000 people, by having the systematic review, by combining 10 different studies which are having 1,000 people, finally you're going to be have 10,000 people for one systematic review. So you're going to be increasing the number. So when the number is increasing, obviously the information what you're going to be get out of the systematic review is going to be much more precise. And narrative reviews, it is going to be subjective. So mostly we can have biases here because we cannot rely upon the findings from a narrative review. But systematic review, most of the times it's going to be objective. So they're going to have a specific objective, and to attain those objectives, usually minimum 2 authors are going to be required. That's one more question from the participants: how many people required to conduct a systematic review? So minimum is going to be 2 people, and later you can have n number. So why there are 2 people required here is everything whatever we are doing in the systematic review can be performed 2 reviewers or 2 authors independently to avoid any personal bias. The individual bias we can try to avoid by having 2 or 3 people. So every procedure starting from search, data extraction, analysis, if there are 2 people are performing individually, if there are some mismatches between both, so they can come together, or maybe they can add any other expert into the reviewer panel or author panel, and then they can come to the consensus, so that we can try to avoid most of the biases which can occur while performing the systematic review. I think this slide is going to be explained to you in detail, the various differences between a narrative review and the systematic review. I think it's very clear for you, the differences between narrative review and systematic review, and also maybe you could have understand that why the systematic reviews are much more important in the literature than the narrative review. So we'll come to the point now, that is various steps which are involved in conducting the systematic review and meta-analysis. So we are going to be list out mainly in 4 steps. A systematic review conduction. The first one is going to be identify the studies, and then we can determine the eligibility of the studies by having inclusion and exclusion criteria. So it is not that once you search for the articles, all the articles whatever you are getting, we are not going to be included in a systematic review. So we are going to be include few which are come under our inclusion criteria, and the remaining we are going to be exclude which comes under the exclusion criteria. So once you have your articles, the included articles with you, the full text articles with you, then you can read the articles and extract the important information from the articles. And at the same time, we are going to be critically appraise the studies. It is not that we are going to be take all the information from all the RCTs. We are going to be critically appraise the RCTs or any studies by using various scales and the tools which are available for validating the studies. And then we can try to see which are the studies which are having the high quality. So based on that, we can give our conclusion. And finally, we are going to be analyze the data by using various statistical procedures. So these are the 4 steps we are going to be discussed in my presentation. Maybe in another 45 minutes to 1 hour time, I can discuss all these steps, various steps which are involved in the systematic review in detail, so that you will be clear before going into the afternoon demonstration sessions. The first thing is going to be identify the studies. We need to identify the studies first, like how we are going to identify the participants for a randomized control trial. We need to identify the studies for a systematic review, right? We need to have a studies first. So before going to be identifying the studies, we need to have a methodology. As I mentioned, we need to have a clear-cut protocol for a systematic review. We are going to be explain everything there, like what are the databases we are going to be search, what are the terms, keywords we are using while searching the articles, and what kind of articles we are going to be exclude and include, and how we are going to be extract the data, and what kind of analysis we are going to be perform. So everything should be mentioned in the methodology section of the protocol, and accordingly we'll go forward, and then we can do everything about the systematic review. So come to the search, we need to search in a popular databases. And I think one thing for sure you can use for a systematic review is PubMed or Medline. Medline is a major component of the PubMed. So both are going to be the same in terms of search. So PubMed is going to be the common one and the very important one. Certainly we need to use it for any systematic review, and at least for maybe systematic review, because it is available freely. At least you can go and search for the articles freely in the PubMed, and you can get all the information. So either you may get the full text articles or not further, but at least you can go and search for the information, and you will get the information in the PubMed. And later on, maybe you can add many other databases along with the PubMed based on the availability and the subscription to your institution. If your institution is having the subscription for other databases like Embase. Embase is one more important database where we can get the literature, the primary and as well as secondary literature. And but we need to pay for Embase. It is not like a PubMed. At least we cannot go and search here. Even for search, we need to pay and use the Embase. And one more important database is Cochrane Library. In the Cochrane Library, especially, you're going to have mainly 2 sections. One is for systematic reviews, another one is for randomized control trials. In the Cochrane Library, you can go and click on the Cochrane Central. There's something called Cochrane Central. So there you are going to get a randomized control trials, and you can get some randomized control trials which are not identified in the PubMed, even from the Cochrane. And coming to the Cochrane, it is free because we are residing in India. So anywhere in India, maybe we can access the Cochrane Library, and we can download the articles freely. Mostly the recent articles we can download freely from the Cochrane Library. You can use them. And apart from that, there are various databases, maybe the Science Direct, or maybe the Scopus, or maybe the Web of Science, ProQuest, and EBSCO. So there are lots of databases which are available for getting the literature, and that depends on you and your institution. If your institution is having the access, maybe you can go for those databases and you can try to collect the information. So apart from the database search, we need to adopt even various other strategies for getting very good literature for the systematic review. So the main thing is we need to perform the hand search. Hand search is from the library or maybe any other journals which are available with you as a hard copy. You can go and do the hand search. If you feel that these journals are not available in any of the databases what you have searched, then you can go and do the hand search, and you will get many other articles from the hand search from the library. And more important step we need to follow is references from the retrieved articles. So we are going to be retrieve various articles from all these databases. So we are going to have various articles from these databases. And one thing for sure you need to do is you need to go and see the references of all those articles which you have already collected, because you may find many other relevant articles which may include, which can include in the systematic review, in your systematic review, which you did not identify from these databases. So it is not that all the journals which are available in the PubMed and all these databases, there may be many other journals which will not be available in the databases. If you go and do the reference section of all the articles what you collected from these databases, you may get many other articles which are not identified from the databases. And also you can go and search for other databases like the Google, especially not the general Google. Maybe for getting the articles, you need to go and search for the Google Scholar, and where you can get the primary literature and all other articles freely. You can go and search freely. At least later you may or may not going to get the full text article, but you can search for the articles. The advantage for the Google Scholar is it is going to have a very good number of journals available in the Google Scholar compared to any other databases what we are going to be search. And later, if you feel that whatever the topic you have selected, it's the most current one, and if you feel that there may be many other studies are going on already, especially the RCTs throughout the world, especially if you want to do any systematic reviews on COVID-19, as we know that many studies are going on currently, randomized control trials on various therapies for COVID-19 as well as for the vaccine. So if you feel that maybe you can add some more information from the ongoing studies, the best platforms where you can go and search for the ongoing information is ICTRP. There's an International Clinical Trial Registry platform by WHO, where you can try to see the various clinical trials which are going on throughout the world. And if there is availability of the current information from there, the current results which are not published yet, maybe you can take that information and you can keep it in the systematic review. And also for US-based trials, if any studies which are going on in US or any other countries, maybe you can get the information from the clinicaltrial.gov, a very important source for getting the unpublished information. And from India, if you want to include any randomized control trials or any other studies which are going on in India, and once again, we have a website called CTRI, Clinical Trial Registry of India, so where you can get some of the information, the latest information, the ongoing information from the trials which are going on in India. So these are the databases maybe you can use for getting the unpublished information, and you can use that as well in your systematic review. But people will ask, like, is it mandated to include the unpublished information? It depends upon your research question. If your research question is the very recent one, where you feel there are a number of studies which are going on, then I think you need to include the unpublished information as well. But we cannot trust the information because it is not published, it is not peer reviewed. So we cannot have a good amount of maybe the strength from these research articles which are ongoing. The next one is how to search for the literature. So once you know we are going to be search for the articles, how we are going to be search. So for that reason, the very important thing we need to have is a PICO. For example, if this is a research question you are having in your mind where you want to perform a systematic review, a 65-year-old male patient with type 2 diabetes mellitus and also having the established cardiovascular diseases, will empagliflozin is going to be useful compared to placebo to prevent the death from cardiovascular causes. So if this is your research question, obviously we are not going to be keep the entire research question in a search box. It is not possible. If you keep everything in a search box, you're not going to be get any articles, I'm sure. So what we need to do is from this entire research question, what we're having, we need to come out with some of the keywords. So the base for the keywords is going to be the PICO. So what you can do is you can have the PICO, P-I-C-O. The P is going to be indicate the patient or population. I is going to be indicate the intervention, C comparison, and O is going to be the outcome. So from the entire question, you can come out with 4 different keywords. I think those 4 different keywords may be useful for us to go and search for the information. So what I can have in my search, when I go and perform the search in PubMed, what I can have is I can have maybe the type 2 diabetes mellitus as one of the search term, and empagliflozin may be one of the search term, and placebo usually no need to keep because we can get the articles anyway. Once you read, you can understand either it's a placebo control or it is a active comparator that you can understand. May not be necessary to keep always in a search term. And the finally I can keep the death or mortality as well as some of the cardiovascular issues as an outcome what we're expecting. So I can come out with maybe 4 or 5 different keywords from this hypothesis. And it is not that only those keywords are sufficient. Along with these keywords, we need to have even the synonyms for all these keywords, because it will not be always true that all the articles are going to be mentioned only type 2 diabetes mellitus as such. Some people they mention diabetes mellitus, some people mention NIDDM or many other terms they can use. So that's the reason for every keyword what we are having here, we need to have a synonym also, so that we can have synonyms as well as the keywords to get a good number of articles on the hypothesis what we are having. And based on these keywords, we can have a set of based on this PICO, we can have a set of keywords which can be useful for searching the databases. And based on those keywords, we can go and search for the articles from a popular databases which are available with us. And we can keep some and we can discard others, because whatever the articles we are getting, after keeping all these keywords, we may get thousands of articles, and all the thousands we may not include in our systematic review, right? So certainly we need to keep some and we need to discard others. And that's going to be once again based on the study criteria there is an inclusion and exclusion criteria we are going to be have. And we are going to be have pre-specified study criteria. Based on that, we can decide which are the articles which are going to be come in and which are going to be out of our systematic review. So the study criteria, how we are going to be keep the study criteria, maybe the study criteria can be based on the study design. Let's say that you want to include only the randomized controlled trials, then you are going to be exclude all other study designs. And you want to include only the intervention as empirical fluorescein, and you are not interested to include any other articles where the intervention is not the empirical fluorescein, maybe other SGLT2 inhibitors, sodium glucose cotransporter 2 inhibitors. And you want to include only the patients who are having the type 2 diabetes mellitus as a disease, not any other conditions. And maybe you want to have some studies where the population they have included only the adults, not the children's and maybe the elderly patients. So like this, these are just examples. So like this, you can have your own inclusion and exclusion criteria based on different aspects. And based on that, once you search for the information, you can read the title. I think by reading the title, you can understand clearly, is it the one which we can include? If you feel that that's a relevant one, then you can go and read the abstract. And after reading the abstract, you can decide either this is going to be the correct article for systematic review or not. And if you feel it's relevant, then you can go and read the full text article. So meanwhile, we can exclude many studies based on the title, based on the abstract, and even reading the full text also. Sometimes we are going to be exclude many studies because we feel that they are not relevant for the systematic review what we are conducting. And many systematic reviews and meta-analysis, mostly we are going to be exclude the case reports, case series, editorials, letters, etc., which are not original research articles. So we are going to be exclude them many times. So once you have the search with you and you have done everything, and finally you come out with the articles which are relevant for you, the next thing is going to be the PRISMA flowchart. So we are going to have the PRISMA flowchart where we are going to be mentioning about the various studies. There are 4 phases: identification phase, screening phase, eligibility, as well as the inclusion of articles. So once you search for the databases of all the databases what you're going to be search, and maybe you can understand how many articles you got from all these databases. And I'm sure if you search multiple databases, you're going to be get so many duplicates. In the sense, the article what you got from PubMed, you may get the same article from Embase as well. Certainly, we cannot include both the articles. We need to exclude the one as a duplicate, and we're going to take only one article. And once you remove the duplicates, then we are going to be screen the records. And based on the screening by title and abstract, we can exclude many articles which are not relevant for us. And after that, you can go and read the full text article of articles what you included. And even after reading the full text articles, you may feel that some of them may not be eligible, so that you are going to be exclude them. And finally, you can see that how many number of articles you have included for your qualitative synthesis, that is systematic review, and how many studies you have included for the quantitative synthesis, that is meta-analysis. So why there are two different boxes here. One is for qualitative, another one is for quantitative. In some of the systematic reviews, let us say you have 20 articles, and all the 20 articles you are going to be include in a systematic review. But all the 20 articles are not having the quantitative information which we can include in a meta-analysis. So in that out of 20, we have only 16 articles where there is a quantitative data, and we are going to be include only those 16 for the meta-analysis. In that case, we are going to be represent both differently. So how many we have included for the systematic review, and how many we have included for the meta-analysis, the quantitative synthesis. And then once you know these are my 20 articles I'm going to include for the systematic review, what we need to do is we need to read all the 20 articles from the starting till the end. And while reading the articles, we are going to be doing mainly 2 things. One is we are going to be extract the data. Another one is we are going to be do the qualitative assessment. That's a critical appraisal of the articles. So we need to extract the data from each and every study while reading the article. And of course, starting from title to the references, all the information may not be necessary for us to do a systematic review. There'll be some important information we need to take from all the articles. And for that reason, what we can do is we can create a database for collecting all the information from all the articles. And the best one is going to be create an Excel sheet with the different headings like name of the study, author, year when it is published, and number of participants involved in the study, and number of participants who are taking the intervention, number of participants who are taking the control, and out of this intervention control group, how many got the outcome. So like this, you can have various headings which you feel important for you for conducting the systematic review in the Excel sheet. And while reading the one by one article, you can extract the data from each and every article and keep it in the Excel sheet. So the advantage for this extraction of data is whenever you need to get any information from any article, the important information, time and again, you don't need to go and check for the full text article. So you have all the information in your Excel sheet. And I think you can go and refer the Excel sheet for any information what you require for the systematic review and meta-analysis. And that's going to be useful for you. As I mentioned, it is not only the extracting the data, at the same time, we need to even critically appraise the information. Critical appraisal is going to be, we are going to be check for the quality of the information which is available in the particular study. And for that, we are going to have various scales and checklists with us. For example, the CONSERT, it's a consolidated standards of reporting trials. It's one of the important checklists we are going to be used to evaluating the quality of randomized control trials. We are going to keep the checklist with us and then go and read the RCT and then try to check that whatever the information they mentioned in the CONSERT, is it really available in the RCT what we are having, right? So they're going to be mentioned various aspects we need to have in RCT in the CONSERT checklist. So we are going to see that really all this information is available in the RCT or not. And it is only the qualitative one, and there may be many other scales like as Deepika was mentioning, there are various other scales which are there for assessing the quality. So we are going to have the risk of bias tool by Cochrane, and we have a Jadad score. So like that, we have many other scoring systems which are available to assess the quality of the articles. And it is not that one scale is going to be useful for all the types of articles. So for every type of article, we have a certain type of checklist and scales which are available for critical appraisal. Let's say, for example, STROBE, strengthening the reporting of observation studies in epidemiology. We are going to use it mainly for the cohort studies, case control studies, and the cross-section studies. So it's like a checklist. And if you want to have a scoring system for assessing the quality, for the same purpose, we are going to have NOS, once again mentioned by Dr. Deepika Bansal ma'am, where it's a Newcastle, whatever scale we are having, it is mainly made for quality assessment of cohort as well as case control studies. And like that, we are going to have the STAT, that's mainly meant for the articles on diagnostic tests. We have a COREC, it is mainly for the qualitative studies like case reports, case series. And we have a PRISMA, that is once again checklist for understanding the quality of a systematic review as well, which are using the randomized control trials. If you want to assess the quality of a systematic review also, we have a checklist called PRISMA. And if the systematic review conducted by using the observational studies, and we can use a checklist called MOOS, that's a meta-analysis of observational studies in epidemiology. So like this, we have various tools which are available for assessing the articles and critically appraising the articles. And all these scales and all these checklists, you can get it freely from this website, equator.network.org. Where you can get all the scales freely from this database. So that's about the critical appraisal. We have done that. And the next part is, so once you collect all the information into your Excel sheet, we need to analyze the data. Whenever you feel that you have a quantitative data from all the studies, certainly we need to analyze the data by using various techniques. That's what we are going to call a meta-analysis. And during the analysis process, maybe you can come across various terminologies. And it's very important for us to understand all these terminologies before to conduct any systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So I'm going to maybe brief you on all these aspects by taking maybe another 10-15 minutes time. So we are going to have the effect size. It's a relative risk, odds ratio, hazard ratio, and a 94% confidence interval. Test for heterogeneity we are going to have, and estimating the summary effects, test for interaction, and publication bias. These are the measures we are going to understand in my presentation now. And we are going to understand there are two important graphs. One is forest plot, another one is funnel plot. So these are the things we are going to discuss in the forenoon session, so that it will be very clear for you in the afternoon sessions. The first thing is, before going to analysis, I think I would like to explain a little bit, especially for the newcomers, like the people who are not having enough understanding on this risk measures like relative risk odds ratio. So please bear with me if you have already seen this slide previously for a few minutes, because I need to explain this to go further. Otherwise, we cannot understand about the forest plot in any other analysis aspects. So we are going to be, first of all, maybe conduct any studies like cohort study, case control study. We are going to be understand the risk by calculating the relative risk or odds ratio. Let us say the hypothesis here it is we want to understand how the hypertension is related to the cardiovascular diseases. Is there any influence of hypertension on the cardiovascular diseases or not? If you want to understand that, we can go and do a cohort study. Maybe like a cohort study like I have taken two groups of people, like people who are having the hypertension 493 and people who are not having the hypertension, that is 1271. Okay, so these are the two groups I'm having initially, where I'm going to follow them for over a period of time like 5 years and 10 years, and then try to understand during the follow period of 5 years or 10 years, how many people got the outcome, that is a cardiovascular disease. Okay, so let us say after following for 10 years, out of 493, there are 90 people who got the outcome, cardiovascular disease. Remaining 403 did not get the outcome. And in case of people who are not having the hypertension, out of 1271, and there are 70 people who got the outcome, cardiovascular disease, and remaining 1201 did not get any outcome. So once you have all these values, we are going to be code them like A, B, C, D, and we are going to be calculate the relative risk, the one which we are going to be use it for the cohort studies. And it's very simple formula, relative risk, A by A plus B divided by C by C plus D we are going to be have. And if you include all these values, we have the value of 3.3 as a relative risk, right? And let us say we did not do the cohort study, we have done the case control study. The case control study, like how we are going to be perform the case control study, we are going to be use two groups once again here. Excuse me. So we are going to be use the two groups here. One is the cases who are having the outcomes and who are having the controls. And what I'm going to do now is I have taken the people who are having the cardiovascular disease, people who are not having the cardiovascular disease, and then gone back and check previously how many people are having this hypertension among the case group and how many are not having the hypertension. At the same time, in the control group, how many are already having the hypertension and how many are not having the hypertension. So out of 160, there are 90 who are having the hypertension, remaining are not having. And out of 1604, 403 are having the hypertension and remaining 1201 not having the hypertension. So once again, we have the ABCD and we are going to be calculate in this case, we are going to be calculate the odds ratio because it is a case control study. And the formula is once again simple. It's a cross multiplication AD by BC. And if you do that, we are going to be get 3.8 is a odds ratio. So now how to interpret that? So we got the relative risk of 3.3 and odds ratio of 3.8 and how to interpret that. So for interpretation of results, either hypertension is a risk factor for causing the cardiovascular disease or not. These two values may not be sufficient. Along with that, we need to have a 95% confidence interval to try to understand better. So let us say here we are going to be have the x-axis and y-axis, and the middle is going to be the one that is a neutral point, and less than 1 and more than 1. So the simple logics here, like whenever you see your value, the relative risk or odds ratio falling less than 1, that means it is a less chance of getting the outcome. Falling more than 1, it's going to be more chance of getting the outcome. So in this case, we got 3.3. That is obviously more than 1. So we can see that there's a more chance of getting the outcome. So more chance of getting the outcome for which group? So obviously we need to apply to the first group what you have taken into the table. So first group in our table is hypertension people. So obviously there is a more chance of getting the cardiovascular disease for the people who are having the hypertension. So that's about 3.3. So along with that, we are going to have the confidence interval. That's a lower limit 2.4 and upper limit 4.4. And what we are going to be understand from this confidence interval is about the significance. What are the value we got here? Is it significant or not? Right? So once it is significant, only we can take any conclusion from the value. So simple to say how we are going to be understand the significance is, I think to mention about one statement, whenever your value is more than 1, and also the lower limit and upper limit of the confidence interval also more than 1, we can say in that case it is significant. Okay, so now all the three values are more than 1, so we can say the value is significant, and we can say there is a more chance of getting the outcome for the hypertensive people. And instead of just saying only the more chance, we can even quantify how much more it is. So for that reason, what we can do is we can take the difference between, as I mentioned, 1 is going to be the neutral point. Always the risk we need to quantify the difference between 1 to our relative risk. So the 1 to our relative risk is 2.3. So we can say that the people who are having the hypertension are having 2.3 times more chance of getting the cardiovascular disease. Sometimes we can see even people who are having hypertension, they may have 3.3 times more. People will say that. But exactly speaking, it is not 3.3, it is only 2.3, because always the risk is going to be start from neutral point. It may be the positive risk or it may be the negative risk. It is going to be start from the neutral point. So that's what we need to consider always. So let us say in this example, even though the relative risk is more than 1.4, saying that there is a risk, but when you see the confidence interval, one value is less than 1 and another value is more than 1. So it is showing that it is not significant, because what you can see here, it is if you do the study multiple times, sometimes it can go into the negative, sometimes it can go into the positive, right? In that case, we cannot come to the final conclusion. So we can say that it is not significant, and overall we can conclude that there is no association identified between the hypertension and cardiovascular disease. If this is the case, whenever the confidence interval lower level is less than 1 and upper level is more than 1. And another scenario is going to be, let us say we got the relative risk of 0.75 and 0.75 is less than 1, obvious. So when it is less than 1, we can say it's a less chance of getting the outcome. And if you say the confidence interval, lower limit is 0.53 and upper limit is 0.92. So at the same time, our value is less than 1, relative risk, lower limit and upper limit also less than 1. They did not cross the 1, they did not cross a neutral value. So once again, we can say this value is going to be significant. So because we are saying it is significant, we can take a conclusion out of it. The conclusion here, it is going to be, once again, we are going to be say it is a less risk. And how much less? The difference, once again, we take the difference from 1 to 0.75. So the difference from 1 to 0.75 is going to be 0.25. So we can say 0.25 times less chance of getting the outcome. Or if you don't feel convenient to say 0.25, 0.5 times, and you can convert that into the percentage and say it's a 25% less chance of getting the outcome when the people are having the hypertension. Okay, so that's what we are going to be take it. Why I explain this in detail is without knowing this basic concept, how to understand the relative risk, odds ratio, hazard ratio, and how to interpret these values along with the confidence interval. So when can we say significant? When can we say not significant? So without knowing this, we cannot interpret any results in the meta-analysis. So that's the reason I have taken a little bit time to explain this to you. I think now if you see the forest plot, you can understand better. So this is the forest plot, which I used to explain for many years, because this is the one I feel more convenient to explain a forest plot, because it is having various aspects we can explain in detail. And this is the forest plot is from the article which is published on 2014 from Tumor Biology. And the hypothesis here, it is pioglitazone therapy and associated bladder cancer risk in diabetes patients. So they want to understand how this pioglitazone is going to be cause the bladder cancer. Either there is a chance of getting the bladder cancer or not after taking the pioglitazone, especially for a longer time among the diabetes patients. So to understand that, they have done this meta-analysis. And if you see here, they have included a total of 9 studies here for this meta-analysis. And all the 9 studies are having different hazard ratios along with their confidence intervals. And it's very easy to, it's very simple to understand a forest plot. It is nothing difficult. So whatever the hazard ratio we are having here, the same thing they have explained here in the forest plot. So let us say the first one is a Dormandi 2005, where the hazard ratio is 2.37. It is showing there is a risk. But however, if you see the confidence interval, the lower limit is less than 1 and upper limit is more than 1. So it is saying that it is not significant, even though it's more than 1, but the value is found to be not significant. The same thing explained in a pictorial way here. So the middle diamond shape is going to be the hazard ratio. I think that comes approximately 2.37. And wherever it is ending left side, that's going to be the lower limit, and the right side is going to be the upper limits. Okay. And the second study, if you take, it is a 4.30. And the 4.30 is going to be much higher than 1. So it is showing that there is a risk. And if you see the confidence interval, lower limit is more than 1, and upper limit also more than 1. So it is also showing that it is significant, right? So this study is going to be significant association between pioglitazone and bladder cancer. And from this study, maybe we can understand 4.30 minus 1 if you make. So we are going to get 3.30. So we can say that people who are having the pioglitazone are having 3.3 times more risk of getting the bladder cancer compared to the people who are not taking the pioglitazone, right? That's what the understanding. Maybe we can have it from here. And we can see the remaining all other studies are found to be not significant. And once again, if you see the Newman 2012, it is found to be significant 1.22, and the confidence interval is more than 1. So here we can understand there is a 22% more chance of getting the bladder cancer when the people are taking the pioglitazone. And the remaining 2 studies or 3 studies which are showing the no association once again. And finally, what we are going to be doing is by using the meta-analysis, by using the software, we are going to be combine the results of all these 9 studies, 9 hazard ratios, and then we are going to be come out with one pooled hazard ratio that is 1.50. What we got is 1.50. Lower limit is 1.14 and upper limit is 1.98. So our final conclusion from this meta-analysis is the pooled value is 1.50 and the lower limit is 1.14 and the upper limit is 1.98. Okay, so from this we can understand there is an increased risk of getting the bladder cancer when the people are taking the pioglitazone, and how much risk means is once again 50%. So 1 to 1.5. If you take the gap, it's going to be 0.5. If you convert into percentage, it's going to be 50%. We can say when the people are taking the overall, we can say when the people are taking pioglitazone, they're having 50% more chance of getting the bladder cancer compared to people who are not taking the pioglitazone. So that's what we are going to be understand from this, the pooled hazard ratio. So like this, we can have a pooled hazard ratio, pooled odds ratio, or pooled relative risk to understand the final conclusion. And one more important aspect in this meta-analysis is the weightages. As I mentioned, I ask you to remember the weightages because in the meta-analysis, we are not going to be give equal weightage for all the studies. We are going to be give the weightage based on the study. If you see here, the study which is Newman 2012, which is having the highest weightage out of 100%. So always the meta-analysis, the weightage is going to be out of 100%. That's going to be divided for all the studies, not equally. And this is the study which is having the highest weightage, 16.96. And Song 2012 is the one which is having the lowest weightage. Okay, so on what basis we are going to have the weightage here? If you see, you can correlate the weightage with some other factors here, especially along with the, you can correlate with the confidence interval. And Newman 2012, which is having the highest weightage, and at the same time it is having the very short, very narrow confidence interval. Song 2012 is the one which is having low weightage, very low weightage, and that is the one which is having the huge confidence interval, the wider confidence interval, right? So we can understand that whenever the study is having the narrow confidence interval, it may have the more weightage. Whenever it is having the wider confidence interval, it is having the less weightage. So now, on what basis the confidence interval is going to be depends upon? So usually the confidence interval is going to be mainly depends upon the population size. More than that, more than the population size, it is going to be mainly depending upon people, number of people, how many got the outcome. So that's going to be decide the confidence interval. And when the population size and the number of people who are having the outcome is going to be more, in that case, we are going to be have the narrow confidence interval. And that's the reason we are going to be have the significant information from that particular article. Okay. So one more correlation here, it is you can see the background box here, the square shaped box. And for the studies where there is a more weightage, the box size is going to be bigger. And for the studies which are having the less weightage, for example, Song 2012, we cannot see the box at all in the behind, right? So the weightage is mainly depending upon the sample size, and the sample size is going to be represent the confidence interval and the background box here. And one more point we need to understand here, it is the overall value. So 1.50 is the overall value that's going to be represented in the diamond shape here. In the diamond shape, you can see the middle value. And so in the diamond shape, the middle value is going to be the overall value 1.50, and through that the dotted line is going to be there, and that's going to be represent the middle value, that is overall value, and the left side is going to be the lower limit and right side is going to be the upper limit. So that's going to be represent the overall value of the overall pooled hazard ratio of the meta-analysis. So why we are not going to be perform the average, why we have to do the meta-analysis? So people may think that why cannot we go with the average by combining all these 9 different values, we can get the average. So the difference here it is, if you do the average, you are going to get 1.82. And if you remove any study from the average, like Song et al, if you remove, your average value is going to be changed definitely, right? But in the meta-analysis, what is going to happen, if you remove the Song et al, which is having the very less weightage on the overall value, if you remove the study and do the meta-analysis once again, your value may not be changed much, because you are removing the study which is having the very less weightage on the overall value, So that's the reason always we need to go and perform the meta-analysis, may not be the average. And one more point, maybe we can take it here is going to be the I-square value and p-value. That's mainly meant for the heterogeneity. And the heterogeneity is the one we are going to be see just to understand, is there any significant difference between one study to another study? Okay, so whenever you see the difference between result from one study to another study, obviously the I-square value is going to be more than 50%, and that shows that there is a heterogeneity between the studies. So based on the heterogeneity, we are going to be use different methods of meta-analysis that I'll show you in the next few slides. So this is a test for heterogeneity. We are going to be perform two tests mainly for understanding the heterogeneity, the difference between result from one study to another study. If you see a small value, we are going to be conducting the Cochrane Q test. If you see after Cochrane Q test, if the p-value is less than 0.1, we can say that the variation is not due to the chance. That means there is a heterogeneity. So if the p-value is less than 0.1, we can say there is a heterogeneity. And if the p-value is more than 0.1, we can say variation due to chance. So we can say there is no heterogeneity. At the same time, we are going to be perform the I-square test. So these all are going to be performed by using the software itself. We are not going to be use any other calculators for this. In the I-square, if you feel it is more than 50%, we can say there is a heterogeneity. And if it's a small value, less than 50%, we can say there is no heterogeneity. Okay, that's what we are going to be understand from this. So based on the heterogeneity, we are going to be choose a model, which model we are going to be used for meta-analysis. Usually in meta-analysis, there are going to be two models. One is going to be fixed effect model. That is a Mantel-Hansel method, we can say. And we are going to be use that fixed effect model when you feel that there is no heterogeneity between the studies. When the heterogeneity is not there, we are going to be use the fixed effect model. And when you see there is a heterogeneity between the studies based on the I-square and the Cochrane Q test, we are going to click on the random effect model. So don't confuse now. Maybe you can understand all these models and analysis, everything maybe in tomorrow's test session, where we are going to be explained to you about Reviman and all the analysis. So you're going to be understand all these things very clearly. Just you can remember these methods so that it will be very clear for you tomorrow when speaker explains to you in detail. Okay, so two things we need to understand here. We need to check for the heterogeneity. And if there is a heterogeneity, we are going to be use random effect model. If there is no heterogeneity, we are going to be use a fixed effect model. Very simple to say. And then we are going to be understand the publication bias. The publication bias means, are we missing any studies which are not published or which may be published? And once again, we are going to be use two tests here, the Beck's test and Eggers test. And from that, we are going to be get the p-value. If the p-value is less than 1.0, we can say there is a publication bias. If the p-value is more than 1.0, we can say there is no publication bias. So publication bias, once again, it is not in our hand. Even though you've done thorough search in all the databases, still sometimes you may get the publication bias, which you cannot able to control because the negative studies may not be published. So we cannot control that. And to understand the publication bias, we can also have the reverse funnel plot. So this one is a reverse funnel plot. So you will get the funnel plot once again from the software what we are using. And from the funnel plot, if you can see publication bias, especially when the studies are like this, when the studies are arranged like this, there are some studies here which are showing positive in the corner. If you don't see any studies negative here, we can say that there may be a publication bias. It is not that our mistake. The negative studies usually they're not going to be published. So if you don't see the studies are distributed throughout this plot, then we can say there is a publication bias. And the test for interaction, there is one more test for interaction. I think very simple to explain. This is one of our systematic review we have published on statin use and risk of breast cancer, a meta-analysis of observation studies. And what we have done is we try to understand the influence of statin on the breast cancer. So we got total 24 studies, and we have done the meta-analysis where we got a pooled relative risk of 0.99, of confidence interval 0.94 and 1.04. So we can understand here there is no association because the value found to be not significant. So we can say there is no association identified between the statin use and risk of breast cancer. So we did not restrict our analysis with that. So what we try to done is we have done the subgroup analysis. So we want to see that if you combine all the 24, we got this result. But if you do the systematic review meta-analysis by taking only cohort studies, what will be the result? By taking only case control studies, what will be the result? Okay, so we thought that, and what we have done is we have pooled separately for cohort studies 13 We have pooled separately case control studies 11, and these are the results we got. Now you can see here once again from the cohort studies as well, what are the final pooled relatives we got. That's found to be non-significant once again. And at the same time, from the case control studies, also the pooled relative is going to be not significant, right? So what's the p-value? The p-interaction value here it is. This all I think I explained already. Test for heterogeneity. So when the p-value is less than 0.1, we can say there is a heterogeneity. As well as I-square value is 57%. It's more than 50%. We can say there is a heterogeneity, and that's the reason for this we have used a random effect model. And this p-value for interaction is going to be mainly meant for to understand, is there any significant difference between the result what we got for cohort studies with the result what we got for the case control studies. So we got two results from two pooled analysis, and we want to understand, is there any significant difference between these two results are coming from two different set of studies, right? So here the p-value is going to be different. The cutoff is going to be different here. It's like a normal biostatistics p-value 0.05. So when the p-value is less than 0.05, we can say that there is a significant difference between these two values. When it is more than 0.05, there is no significant difference between the two values. So in this case, it is 0.35. So we can understand it is more than 0.05. So we can say that there is no significant difference identified between the results what we got separately for cohort and separately for the case control studies. So like that, try to understand the differences between subgroup analysis by using the P4 interaction. So P4 interaction we are going to use to identify the differences. And coming to the final few slides, the meta-analysis softwares, I think all of you may be having the question, which software we are going to be using for the meta-analysis, which one is going to be available freely. The one we suggest obviously is going to be the Reviewman Review Manager, which is by the Cochrane, which is freely available. Once again, we can download it, Reviewman freely into our computer, and we can use it for any systematic review. It is not only meant for Cochrane systematic reviews. Certainly, we are going to be using this for Cochrane, but if you want to perform other than the Cochrane, also you can use the Review Manager. And the Review Manager mainly useful for conducting all the analysis, whatever I shown you analysis part. We are going to be use Reviewman for all those types of analysis. And tomorrow, I think you're going to be get a clear-cut understanding about using Reviewman for all the analysis from one of the session from the expert. And apart from that, we have many other softwares which are available freely, which we can use it for the meta-analysis, like meta-analyst, epi-meta, easy meta-analysis, meta-test, and meta-stat. And there are some commercial softwares as well, especially for conducting the meta-analysis, like CMA is a one, comprehensive meta-analysis, which we are using commonly for meta-analysis. It's a paid version. It's very easy to handle. We can get all the graphs very easily. It is similar to the Excel sheet. We can just go and click the option what we want, and it's going to be generate all the analysis, right? It's going to be very easy, but we need to pay money to use the software. And similarly, we have MetaWin, easy meta-analysis, and various other softwares. So we can also conduct the meta-analysis by using some of the general statistical packages like Stata, SAS, R, S+. These are some general statistical packages we are using for all the types of analysis. And the same software can be used for even conducting for the meta-analysis. So these are some of the various softwares we can use for the systematic review meta-analysis. And for your further understanding, I prefer maybe you can go to the Prisma. That's a preferred reporting items for systematic review and meta-analysis Prisma checklist, where you can understand most of the things about the systematic review. And also there's something called Moose checklist and Moose guidelines as well, where you can understand how to perform a systematic review meta-analysis by taking the observation studies in epidemiology. So always, I think before starting performing a systematic review meta-analysis, it's always preferable to go and check this checklist so that you can try to understand what is the process we are going to be conduct. And once you conduct, how we are going to be prepare the manuscript and publish the systematic review. You will get a very clear understanding from this checklist. And various other resources maybe I can suggest for you for better understanding about systematic review meta-analysis in the future. And if you want to be an expert in this area, I think certainly these things are going to be very helpful for you. And the major one is going to be the Cochrane Handbook for Systematic Reviews and Interventions. The very important book, I think it's going to be like a Bible, Grantha, or any other we can say in terms of systematic review and meta-analysis. So whatever the question you have in terms of systematic review meta-analysis, it is going to be answered by the Cochrane Handbook of Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis Interventions. So it is available. I think online copy is available freely. Maybe you can use it, or otherwise it is available in the HTML format. You can search for it and you can use it for all of your queries in terms of systematic review. And I can suggest you, if you want to be an expert in systematic review meta-analysis, I can suggest you some of the training sessions which are given by the Cochrane, the very important organization in terms of systematic reviews. They're going to have various training modules. Maybe you can go and attend those training modules to get more information about the systematic reviews conduction. And one more, I think, source is you can attend the various sessions, which are workshops which are conducted by. Earlier, actually, the same center was managing the South Asian Cochrane network and center, but currently it is not there. Now they're trying to come out with a Cochrane India center. But still, this is a center. Still, they're conducting various training sessions for systematic review meta-analysis, like BVMC. There's a BV Moses Center for Evidence-Informed Healthcare and Health Policy, which is there in the Christian Medical College, CMC Vellore. So there's a specific group there who are going to be organized the conferences and who are going to be organized the workshops, symposiums for especially on systematic reviews and meta-analysis. If you're really interested, maybe you can attend those workshops so to get more understanding on the systematic reviews. And also maybe one more good opportunity for you is going to be attend the conferences, the very big conferences which are organized by the Cochrane on the name of Cochrane Colloquium. Fortunately, I got an option to attend this Cochrane Colloquium in 2014, which was held in Hyderabad. So once again conducted by this BVMC Center. And this time it is going to be actually supposed to be there in 2020, but cancelled because of COVID-19. And next time it is going to be there in Canada, in Toronto in 2022. Maybe you can just go to the website and try to see what are the other contents are there. And the advantage for this one Cochrane Colloquium is you can even present your abstracts. But as per my experience, even though it's a Cochrane Colloquium, usually they're not going to be accept the systematic review meta-analysis, normal systematic review meta-analysis. You need to have something different. So if you come out with any different aspect of a Cochrane review, which can be a development of methods or any other aspects which can improve the standards of systematic review, if you have any work related to that, not like a normal systematic review, simple systematic review meta-analysis, you can certainly send it to the Cochrane Colloquium and it will be accepted so that you can able to present in the Cochrane Colloquium. It's going to be the big event with all the experts of Cochrane and other systematic reviews. You can able to meet them, and so you can have a very good understanding from this Cochrane Colloquium as well. And one moreover, you can apply for the stipends, scholarships, and if your application got selected, you're going to get the scholarship so that you can freely attend the session by having even the travel support as well from the Cochrane organization. So these are the various resources which are available to get more information further on the systematic review and meta-analysis. And with this, I think I have taken more time just to explain in detail about the systematic review meta-analysis. Thank you so much for your patience listening. And these are my mail IDs. So if you have any questions, maybe please mail me and I'll try to reply as soon as possible. So thank you so much for all the